Welcome back to another edition of the Edge podcast. Publisher Brendan Slaughter here, joined by the whole Edge crew. Senior writer Ryan Harlan, writer Brogan Slaughters. We're here breaking down Oregon State being selected as the number 8 national seed in the Corvallis Regional. And man, a lot to get into here on the big podcast. The Beavers will be playing St. Mary's on Friday night. TCU and USC will play in the earlier game that day, and then the winners will play, and we'll see how it all goes from there. But man, fellas, no conference tournament for Oregon State. Kind of a crazy race to the finish where they didn't do anything. They were just idle. And somehow, some way, we all watched the projections. They found their way into that national seed mix. Let's start with you, Ryan. Just your thoughts on them getting into the top 8. Did you think, we talked a little bit on the radio leading up to it, but it was no means a certainty heading into the selection show.
Yeah, no, and the point I'll echo, and I've kind of hit it ad nauseum, especially on radio too, is that for the Beavers to get within striking distance of that top 8 spot, they needed to sweep, and then also too needed some help across the country in those conference tournaments to make sure that a top 8 seed was guaranteed. And sure enough, they did get the help that they needed and were borderline there. So looking at kind of how everything played out with teams playing those conference tournaments, which probably hurt their chances of getting a national seed. I know mentioning about Florida State, who the Beavers are paired up with, should Oregon State advance past the Corvallis Regional, then make it on to supers. They were in a spot for that, but lost to North Carolina in the ACC tournament. So that's something there where I think seeing how things played out nationally, in addition to just taking care of business, I think really just benefited the Beavers. And I think that's the mindset that Mitch and the rest of the squad have coming into this weekend. It's, hey, it's an opportunity to go 1-0, and then we'll go from there. Another opportunity to go 1-0, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So that's, I think, the mentality they've adopted, and I think it paid off for them in getting that top 8 spot.
No, it's amazing that, what a difference a week makes, Ryan, because here, a week ago we were talking about, maybe Oregon being in that national seed mix, and I think that was kind of contingent on them winning the Big Ten tournament, as we, come to find out, as, them losing to Nebraska knocked them down to 15, and all of a sudden Oregon was out of that mix, and all of a sudden Oregon and Oregon State's head-to-head series didn't really seem to matter as much. And, Brogan, I'm curious your thoughts on just sneaking into the top 8. You and I were talking over the weekend. It really, by no means was it a lock. I mean, I thought they were on the outside looking in. So I think, the committee really liked that top, what, I think it ended up 7th RPI.
Yeah, like you said, the Ducks not winning their conference tournament maybe didn't help, but also not getting game 1 by Nebraska. That definitely did not help them, drop them down to 13. Coastal Carolina maybe got the short end of the stick a little bit. That's kind of where we saw the baseball blue blood bias come in. They gave us that because we've been here before. We proved that we can be a national seed. But I think it's a good placement. Bit of a tough draw. We got good teams in the regional for sure. TCU is going to be tough. St. Mary's going to be tough.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you look, if you're going solely by RPI, LSU ended up being one of the top 8 national seeds and ended up with an RPI of 11, right? So I think there's always going to be a little bit of, bias to an extent. But I think in this case, the team that I thought was Oregon State's biggest competition, Coastal Carolina had one heck of a season. And I really thought they had a strong case to be a top 8 seed too. They ended up with more wins than anybody, I believe. They had 48 wins on the year, won both their conference tournaments, and they were originally projected to be the 8 to Oregon State's 9 in one of the most recent projections. Then it kind of flipped, and they finished with an RPI of 8 right behind Oregon State. So I do think the Beavers got a little bit of a favorable seed. However, I think the committee really looked at how Oregon State's quad games improved. And I think Cal Poly kind of rising up, making the field helped. I think, Nebraska ending up, making noise late in the season made that series loss look a little bit better. And then I think, the Oregon series can kind of just be written off as like a bad weekend, which, pretty much this year, every team, even the SEC teams, have warts where it's like, hey, maybe that was a not so great weekend. So In that sense, I do feel like Oregon State is on par with these other national seeds. There isn't a dominant one seed this year that's just kind of towering above all. There seems like it's pretty congested in that, really, I might even say top like 18. There were even some teams on the bubble of hosting that didn't, that I was a little surprised. So that's kind of just the way the cookie crumbles, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think TCU could have got a chance to host it, a 15 or 16 national seed, and they're in our bracket as a two seed. So it's just there's some really good teams that are spread out everywhere, and there's a lot of deeper national, not quite national seeds, but Clemson and Tennessee coming in at 10 and 11. Those are really, really good teams over on that side of the bracket. So I'm glad that we're where we at maybe on that side of things.
Yeah, obviously the Corvallis Regional paired up with the Tallahassee Regional as well. So the good news with Oregon State being a national seed, should they win their regional, they will also host the Super Regionals at Goss. So that's obviously tremendous news because, as we know, in the history of the Super Regional era, Oregon State has not made Omaha without winning Supers at Goss. There's been some different ways where they haven't been a national seed and made that happen, but regardless, you want to be at home, and it guarantees a much easier path to Omaha. So in that sense, mission accomplished for Oregon State. But like Bergen was saying, kind of diving into it a little bit just with a day and a half, of research. St. Mary's obviously were able to win their tournament to reach, but a 30 win, 20-ish loss team. Same with USC. USC I think obviously brings in the name recognition and had a decent year in the Big Ten, and played a lot of games on the road. I think that helped their metrics, but. Like Brogan was saying, I really think TCU is going to be the team to watch out for in this regional for sure. Not to downplay St. Mary's or SC, but I think it's tiered. I think you've got Oregon State, TCU, and then maybe a little bit of a gap in those next couple teams. And TCU's got a pretty good offense, decent pitching staff. Depends on if they save their ace for that second game. But overall, just Brogan, what are your thoughts on the Corvallis Regional field itself? And compared to some other teams, how do you think the draw is? I mean, we saw teams like compared to the West Coast. Do you like the draw over getting like UC Irvine and Cal Poly? Maybe two teams you've
Yeah,
already played this year who were also West Coast teams and could have come to your regional.
right. I think the draw
Arizona.
is I think it's a tough draw. Like we were saying, we got three really good teams that we're playing against. They have a lot of common opponents. They've played a lot of the Irvines, the San Diego's, UCLA, so they're familiar with the schedule. And I don't exactly have it pulled up, but some of these other teams like LSU, I think they really got bailed out in their regional. They don't. DBU's historically a pretty solid program, but I don't think they're all that. Even our partner in the regional, Florida State, I don't see anybody else besides them coming out of that regional. Mississippi State's pretty good, but I think we did get a tougher draw overall for sure. And being that last national seed, maybe it makes a little bit more sense.
And
Um,
yeah, perhaps Oregon State having a week off too. There is that compared to just about everybody else in the field. I mean, I think Oregon State might have been, I don't want to say only because I can't guarantee that, but very few teams don't play conference tournaments. So it was kind of interesting to see them idle this last weekend. But to your point, I think we'll see with the matched up super regional. Northeastern is intriguing. I think they have the longest win streak in college baseball, like 20 something in a row. But when you go down to, Tallahassee and you play a national seed and play in a stadium in a size you haven't played in all year, things change a little bit. And that's why we said the benefit for Oregon State being at home. USC, there's some familiarity there. If I'm Oregon State, I'm not scared of anybody in this regional. Like you said, I think it's a decent draw. I think TCU could be a really good kind of or a regional final type opponent. And if I'm pegging it right now, I think that would probably be my regional final would be Oregon State and TCU. But that's only because, TCU had a relatively, solid, finish the season. And like we were saying, they were right there in the hosting mix as well. They're, like Brogan said, some common opponents. They did, lose in the Big 12 tournament to Arizona, who also made the field. So, like Brogan was saying, other than a few teams who I think maybe got a couple lucky four seeds, and I think Oregon State matches up well with St. Mary's. I mean, I think St. Mary's is a solid program, but I don't think that's a big time worry game, even though baseball can be pretty open ended. But just based on, what you've seen, Brogan, what do you think ultimately is going to be the mindset heading into this weekend for this team now that, you've had a week off? We heard last week, the guys got to have some off time, do some fishing, just kind of got away from baseball and, then had like the home run derby and everything we saw going on this last weekend. Do you think they'll be kind of ready to go after having some time down?
Yeah, yeah. So going back, I think maybe that Big 12 championship game could have been the difference between TCU hosting as the national seed and beating Arizona. But going into this weekend, like you said, we've had some off days, some fun, fan experiences and whatnot. I think they're playing really loose and they're having fun with it, but they're also really locked in and they know what the goal is and they know they got to come to this regional and they just got to win. You don't want to drop your first game in the same areas. You don't want to get on that loser's bracket trying to claw your way back. You got to win the first game, hopefully win the second game, and just not look back until you're in the supers.
Ryan, you were obviously around the team last year like I was. I'm curious your thoughts on how much you think, because there's still a lot of guys that were on the team last year. And I'm curious how much you think that Kentucky series and just how brutally painful they ended the postseason last year maybe still resonates in the mind as a motivating factor.
I'd say it's probably pretty prevalent still. I know there wasn't really a lot of questions asked about that because obviously, it's like, hey,
It's in the
take care of
past, sure.
business take care of business this weekend, and then you're on to supers at that point. So I think you probably get a little more candid answers from the squad as we get to that point. But like I'd say that's a motivating factor, especially in the fact that, that year too, like you had the ability to still host a super at
Hmm.
home, but things didn't go your way in the regular season. You end up going on the road. You get paired with an SEC team. You travel to Lexington, and arguably the worst performance of the season that year as well in those two games.
Right.
It's like did what he could in that final game, but like I think it's a motivating factor. It's like you were
Sure.
close. You've been on three, at least for Keljo. I know he was saying today, Nelly was saying that like, hey, you've been on three, teams now, postseason teams. You haven't gotten to Omaha yet, but that's always still the goal. And I think that's something that's still, kind of motivating. It's like, yeah, we were not quite there yet. And I think this is the team that I think could, make that push, but it's more
Yeah.
of, you just got to take care of business for that. But I think it's a big factor, I would say, in particular with like, you never want to end your season like that either. Like
Right.
even Mitch was saying too, like during that '06 campaign, in kind of like nothing's guaranteed and kind of saying like, yeah, we had our bags packed like every single weekend because we knew clawing our way through the losers bracket,
Right.
there was a high chance that we could go home at any point. But being able to like use that as kind of grounding and not make the moment bigger than it is, I think that's something that I think will benefit Oregon State in particular. That's something that they have been discussing kind of in the prep and lead up to the Corvallis Regional this weekend.
I think it's amazing, Ryan, that, not only in '06, but in 18, I still think it's amazing that Oregon State is the only school to lose their first college World Series game in both years, run through the losers bracket and take home the championship. So it's amazing kind of how that's happened not once but twice and still to the same team. But I couldn't agree more. I think that postseason was painful. You think about the firepower they had with Bazana and others last year in addition to the more pitchers as just the team was good last year. But like Ryan said, there was definitely an expectation that there was a little bit of underperforming. I think back to I think they lost a series to USC, for example. There was swept by Cal on the road. This just off the top of my head that I can remember. But there were some tough series this year. Like Ryan and I and Brogan have talked about, outside of the 4 games to Oregon, the Nebraska series does not look as bad anymore. So when you break it down, you're like, okay, you took one of two from Nebraska, not great, and then you're like, okay, the 4 games to Oregon. Outside of that, Oregon State was a pretty consistent team all year, and I think that's why you saw them rewarded with the top 8 seed. Brogan, we know you have some time crunch obligations, and we're going to lose you to class here momentarily. Just give us your final thoughts entering this regional before Ryan and I take over and wrap up the pod. What are you most excited to see just from the team, and kind of how do you think it's going to shake out?
Yeah, I'm just most excited to see the younger guys step up. We know we have a solid 1-2, but you want to see that third and fourth pitcher and the rest of the bullpen be able to play in these games, especially if you do lose one or lose more than you expect. and hope that you have that bullpen depth to help you claw back if you need to. But like I was saying earlier, the bats seem pretty locked in. Some guys, Trent Carraway, Cannon Reeder, they're getting really hot at the right time. You got to hope maybe the lineup is a little top heavy at times and you want to see the production more spread out. But I think they're in a good spot and they're ready, and they're going to be ready when teams come to Goss, and they're going to want to win.
Yeah, it's going to be a great atmosphere this weekend. Again, gets underway Friday during the day with TCU and Southern California squaring off, then Oregon State and St. Mary's later at night. Brogan, obviously appreciate your time, and we'll be catching up. Brogan will be at Goss this weekend as well. Make sure to stay tuned to BeaversEdge.com. Brogan, appreciate your time. Ryan and I will take over and finish up the pod. So, Ryan, obviously now just switching gears a little bit, I'm just kind of curious. Obviously, what was kind of the mood and vibe? Brian, just got back from media availability today. Just kind of expand a little bit on the vibe from the players and who'd you catch up with today outside of Mitch and Keljo?
Mitch, Nelly, Kleiny as well too, and then Dax
Nice,
as
nice.
well. So those are the guys that we talked to today. Pretty much the vibe is kind of like, all right, like we got that top eight seed. All right, now it's time to focus on this weekend. It's time to focus on St. Mary's. It's one game at a time kind of mentality. And yeah, the guys are
Yeah.
ready to turn the page to the postseason. I know they were talking about how beneficial the day off of just like not having any play during conference tournament weekend was nice, and nice welcome distraction too, just to not focus on baseball for a while, at least for like a couple days or so. And I know like yeah, some guys went fishing. Gav and
Yeah.
TC went fishing. Nelson and Dax both went golfing as well. They were talking
Nice.
about who's the worst golfer on the team, and funny enough, that's Joey Munt.
Oh, really? The old
Yeah.
man. How is the old man not the best golfer? He's got
But
time, man.
but Mitch was like, hey,
That's
like the
funny.
fact that the golf games weren't great is like that shows that the guys are focused, they're ready to
Dedicated,
go.
yes.
So that's something that like even today too, like you saw guys coming in and around getting practice swings in. I know Iva was around briefly, and then
Mm.
guys are going in, getting ready to prep for this weekend and doing some film study. So they haven't really like gone into like depth yet, but that's kind of what today's going to be for
hmm
them a little bit more, go a little more in depth, understand these other three teams that are coming in and what they bring. I know at least for some of the players on the squad, the familiarity of playing USC is, something that they'll have in to their advantage. So the guys that were, on the team last year and then the year before that, they'll know kind of what to expect going into,
Yeah.
should the Beavers match up with the Trojans in the Corvallis Regional, because it's baseball, anything can happen.
Right.
So there's at least that familiarity there, but like they've already done some kind of preliminary on St. Mary's and TCU. So it's really just getting ready to go all full speed ahead to this weekend on Friday.
Yeah, I'm curious, because now that we get into kind of the nitty-gritty of it, Ryan, the rotation changed, pitching rotation after the Oregon series. Mitch Cannon was like, we need to shake things up a little bit. My question for you is, as we get into it, the regionals are interesting, especially when you're a top seed, because you oftentimes will see teams tweak rotations a little bit based on the degree of opponent. So I don't want to downplay St. Mary's, but in the past, you've seen teams not throw their ace in the first game, perhaps save the ace for Saturday's game. Would you say right now that Segura is quote quote in that ace role and he could be moved around as such? Or do you think it's more interchangeable where they really, I mean, it's kind of interesting because I could see an argument for after a week off kind of being able to throw whoever you wanted in that first game against St. Mary's. So I'm very, very perplexed on what they will do because usually you have conference tournament, you have a series the week before, and it's like, well, you can really maybe only move your Friday or Saturday guy. They could throw anybody, right?
Theoretically, yes. I know
Yeah.
Mitch didn't really
Tip his
like
hand.
expand upon that too much.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
also
yeah.
too, he's kind of like, hey, we're gonna, dive
Wink and
into
a
it more
nod.
as we get into the nitty-gritty with breaking down each of our opponents. But I mean, realistically, I probably would expect Segura to be at least out there and kind of like maybe the guy to set the tone. And
Sure.
probably like even too, Kleinschmidt today was talking about the fact that he might get called upon to be in that high leverage
Mm.
situation, to close out a regional.
Okay. Okay.
So that's something where like I think they may stick with it. Stick with it, just like a gut feeling of what the rotation has been kind of since. But like I really think though it's kind of dealer's choice to
Right.
be exact. Like there's several guys that they could go with, even too, like Nelly, he could go on two different days as well, coming out of the pen. And you also have Wyatt Queen and Kellen Oakes to kind of be sort of that like middle inning closer-ish type of
Sure.
role, right? So like that versatility there gives you some options as well. But like if I had to guess, I assume you probably stick with Segura on Friday to
Hmm.
give yourself a chance to, focus on Saturday and then Sunday as well too. But like I could realistically also see like, it's St. Mary's, and not to overlook St. Mary's either. It's like, you could probably throw Dax out there as well too.
Right.
But I know like Dax is kind of looking forward to a potential TCU matchup as well.
Right.
So like, it's something where like that could also be in play too. I really think it really just comes down to, the strengths and weaknesses of each of the three teams and how your guys match up against them and how you want to go out with stacking that order. But like if I were to at least give a projection, I think Segura starts Friday. If I just had to go off a gut feeling, that's
Yeah.
probably what I would say. But like that's also more of a, I think Mitch is keeping the cards pretty close to the vest for the most part.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's apt. I mean, it's one of those things where I don't think you can necessarily go wrong because I think Oregon State has a pretty strong 1, 2, 3. Just following up on that before I expand further, do you think Nelson Keljo is kind of permanently in the bullpen for the postseason, or do you think that's amenable to whatever the situation is too, based on what we see in the weekend?
Nelson was kind of saying, I think it was more of a like, hey, like whatever, this weekend throws, I'm
Sure.
gonna do
Hmm.
what's asked of me. So like there's been times where I think it was even last year where he got called out of the bullpen twice
Right.
in the Corvallis Regional. So like if that's another case for him, like yeah, like that's where he thrives. That's where he's, being able to be his best at. And I think if the situation calls for that, like I think Nelson is going to step up there on the mound and deliver in a high
Yeah.
leverage spot. But also too, like if should we even have like a Monday,
Sure.
game similar to what happened with UC Irvine last year, I wouldn't be surprised either to potentially maybe see him in that spot. If they
Good
want to
point.
save him for that. Like I think like that's something too that you could realistically like, kind of put him in that position as well too, with kind of how your bullpen stacks up and also like for some of these other guys that are coming out, like Kellen and even Wyatt Queen too,
Sure.
can, be able to deliver in those spots in addition to Nelly. So like the onus I don't think is entirely on him to be kind of like the guy that's going to deliver in those high leverage situations, but he's one of like three or four guys that I could see realistically kind of being relied upon out of that bullpen. So yeah, he's going to
Right.
be more I think in there, and I think that more suits kind of what he's doing. But like being able to build him up at least early on in the season, I think is something that like pays off now in the postseason. So like got up to
Right.
90 pitches at one point. Like he's thrown realistically about 40, 50 in outings out of the pen recently. So like, it's
Yeah.
not anything
Yeah.
for him. So like if he needs to get called upon again, like he can, go out there, give you 1 to 2 or so. So yeah.
Right. I mean, and just, historically speaking, you think back to, even the Oregon State winning championships teams, there were times they had to, as Ryan mentioned, win out of a loser's bracket. And if you lose a game, right, you need to have the pitching depth to come back from it. And that's where, I think back to a couple years ago, Ryan, like when Oregon State went down to LSU for the regional and their pitching staff was injured, injured, injured with a capital I. And, you could tell that even though they were really able to push that Dylan Cruz, Paul Skeens team, they just needed a little bit more in the pitching department. So it's really the thing that gives me great promise for where this postseason can go if things click for Oregon State. You've got pitching depth, and beyond just pitching depth, there are a couple guys in that bullpen who are capable of like, hey, it's a final game of regional. We got no arms. We need you to start. And there are a couple guys who could do that. So that's definitely promising for sure. And I think, as I look at it, Ryan, and we just expect things to go chalk. TCU has one really good ace. Tommy Lepore has a sub 3 ERA, 8-2 on the year, almost 90 innings pitched, 83 strikeouts to just 26 walks on the year. And I had heard about him coming into the tournament, and my kind of curious thought and just how the chess moves are played. Do they throw him against USC on Friday, or do they assume that they may meet Oregon State in the Saturday? So that's kind of the other part of the chess match that I love too, is the other teams are kind of thinking the same way. Like, we'd like to maybe have our best pitcher face the best team, but sometimes when you start playing that, game, you can overthink it a little bit too. So I'm very curious to kind of see how the lineups are going to be the lineups. You might see some tweaks here and there, but we generally know how that's going to shake out. It's how the pitching rotation shakes out that just fascinates me in the postseason, Ryan.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. And also too, like even if you play that chess match, right, you run the risk of throwing guys out of a routine
Hmm.
as well too, because each guy, has their routine, their what to prep for each and every week and how they go about handling business before they go out there and deliver you 5, 6 innings
Right.
of work. So that's something to also consider too in this chess match as well, because like, if you throw a guy that normally goes on Fridays and you say like, move him to a Saturday or Sunday spot, it maybe things could be thrown off slightly there in terms of what you're looking for. You run that risk, but like that's also part of the game of baseball, right? Like, you want to throw your best guy against the best team that you're playing against to give your shot, there to win everything in this regional. So I think that's something that, you just kind of have to play it by what the matchup gives you, and then you kind of just go from there and respond accordingly.
Absolutely. And again, just looking closer at the matchup on Friday, again, Oregon State and St. Mary's will be the second game. St. Mary's, Ryan, kind of looking at it, probably would not have made the field if they didn't win their conference tournament. RPI checks in at 89, which, that's, pretty low for making the tournament. Kind of just some interesting numbers with them. 5-19 against quad one teams. That's where Oregon State is. I like those odds, right? I know that St. Mary's is getting hot at the right time, but losing record against or a wide losing record against a quad one team, 6-9 against quad two. Then they have winning records against quad three and four. So again, or I'm sorry, excuse me, looked at the wrong numbers there. Sorry, all these. St. Mary's 1-7 against quad one teams, 3-0 against quad two, 10-8 against quad three, 21-9 against quad four. So apologies, was looking at Texas Tech's numbers. They blended together, but still 1-7 against quad one. Still a number that I like, but 3-0 against quad two. They could. I think it's a good kind of test for Oregon State. Good warm up, kind of get you ready for the postseason. I think they will challenge them. Oregon State will still have to not overlook them by any means, Ryan, but I think it'll be a good kind of warm up test, getting you ready for kind of the tougher teams that I think you'll face in the regional.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. And also too, I think in terms of like compared to the field from this year to last year, looking at having Tulane and Nichols
Right?
in last year, like those weren't any pushover teams by any means. Very offensive heavy teams, kind of in lower RPI seeding
Irvine
there, and
too.
that's
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and also Irvine as well. So at least for this one, I can like say that you at least have an opponent that will give you a challenge, but also too like is a little more favorable compared to what you got coming out of last year as well, because like I remember watching that game one against Nichols and Tulane, and I'm like, I wouldn't want to face either of these teams
Yeah, it
right
was
now.
it was by no means a gimme weekend, and
So
yeah.
yeah, So that's something there where I'm like, at least for this one, I'm like, okay, that should be a good kind of measuring stick, I think, from where you're at right now before you go into facing a TCU.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to downplay the potential
No,
of
no, no, of
US
course, yeah.
of USC and Southern Cal, but again, everything that I've kind of read, indicated they kind of, were played better baseball at the beginning. They kind of limped their way into the field a little bit. Again, you never know. Teams get hot at particular times. USC, the one thing that makes them a bit intriguing to me is just kind of like a flyer team, Ryan. They didn't have a home ballpark all year. USC, and I think that's obviously why their RPI was high, right? Because they played a lot of road games. The USC baseball stadium's under renovation, a lot of neutral site games too. And I think that was probably, quote, a part of their RPI being higher. I mean, I look at it now and they do get some, quote, home games, but playing at a semi-neutral site. That's intriguing to me because they've been on the road a lot this year, but I really think that even with USC having an RPI in the 40s, Ryan, and I know RPI isn't everything, but when you consider Oregon State 7, TCU 17, USC in the 40s, and then St. Mary in the 80s, that's kind of like what I was saying earlier. Two teams at the top, a team kind of in the middle, and then a team who wouldn't have made it if they didn't win their conference tournament. So, uh, you know, to Ryan's point, looking at TCU, they were just on the doorstep of hosting. We talked about it earlier. They maybe beat Arizona. Maybe they do host, not as a national seed, but just as a top 16 host. They go 8-8 against quad one teams, so about 500. 12-7 against quad two teams, and then dominate quad three and quad four. Let's look at their home road splits here. TCU a lot better, or actually pretty even. 22-7 at home, 15-8 on the road, and then 2-3 neutral. This is a team, Ryan, that will not be intimidated by coming to Goff Stadium as far as like having played in big stadiums all year for that kind of a thing. But the matchup seems good. I still think it favors Oregon State based on how it goes, but. If I'm a betting man right now, it's TCU and Oregon State in that regional final. Obviously, things could change, but I think that's going to be the game, and I think that's going to ultimately be, how we see the weekend play out.
Yeah, no, likewise on that. At least if I had to like give an early projection of how things
Sure.
are going to kind of fall, I'd fall in that boat right now. But yeah, then again, this is postseason baseball. Anything can happen. It's the beauty of it. It's the most exciting time of the year in the season. So that's the part where it's like you could always run into a little bit of chaos, especially in the regional too. Like, I mean, even take last year with
Right.
the rain delay in the regional final and that getting pushed to Monday. So
Right.
that's something there where like, that you just got to respond to anything and everything.
Right. I mean, it's definitely one of those things where, I mean, it's gonna happen, Ryan. Like, I think back to last year, and I was looking at the bracket last year just to kind of compare it. It's like, obviously Oregon State won their regional. They weren't a surprise, but like Arizona lost their regional when they hosted. West Virginia won theirs. Arkansas lost their regional. I mean, it's bound to happen. You just hope that it's not you because every year there is a team that you're like, oh my gosh, they were a 3 seed and so and so's regional and they won the thing going away. And, that happens every year. And, as I look around this year, you never know where to pick. But like I said, I think not only is Oregon State's regional tough, Ryan, I think for what it's worth, just not purely, rival or anything. I think Oregon got a really tough regional, having to play, Arizona and Cal Poly, two teams that won their conference tournaments and are playing quite well too. I mean, Oregon State played, and I look at, Coastal Carolina got Florida in there. Some of the SEC teams got a little bit better draws, I think, than others. But as I look around, there is the potential for some chaos around college baseball. And I think honestly, Ryan, like it's not. I get it. There aren't 85 million people filling out college baseball brackets like college basketball brackets, but just the way the format breaks and all the chaos that can ensue. It's a sneaky underrated postseason, man, and I'm excited for another one.
Oh no, likewise too. And yeah, like you mentioned with the draw that the Ducks got, that's not even an easy regional either. Like
No.
Cal Poly and Arizona are getting hot right now as well too. Then similar deal Utah Valley as well. They got hot, won their tournament to get in to the regional. So that's something where it's like even then that 4 seed, I wouldn't really overlook them either on top of
Right.
that. But that's the nature of college baseball and the postseason. Like, it's the beast that you got to deal with. And yeah, we got several slate of games to look forward to. And then yeah, it should the Beavers take care of business, at least on their side of things. They'll host Super and go from there. So
Yeah, I'm
yeah.
definitely mighty intrigued to keep an eye not only on Oregon State's, but the Tallahassee regional, and then even above, because should things go chalk, Oregon State's first potent, whoever wins the Oregon State regional, Tallahassee regional, that super regional winner would play the winner of the Nashville Hattiesburg regional in Omaha too. So you're really following the bracket the entire way, putting the cart before the horse. But yeah, absolutely very excited because we talked about it, Ryan. Last year they felt that, maybe things would have broke differently if they had been at home instead of playing Kentucky in the Supers because we saw, they handled the tough regional and then ran into a Kentucky team that, had a lot of guys that are in the majors or in the minors, I should say, but drafted guys. So it was a good team and, they kind of ran into a brick wall. So I think if you can take care of business, you host the Supers at Goss. I think it's closer to what we saw back with Auburn in 2022, where it's like, okay, maybe two really good teams here, and it's best 2 out of 3 wins. And as the saying goes, Ryan, regionals are a little bit different, but once we get to super regional play, I like Oregon State's chances having to have an opponent beat them twice in their own house, and I think I can live with that as we head into the postseason. Final thoughts from you.
Yeah, likewise on that, and especially too, like for those teams that are in the Tallahassee regional, if you expect Florida State, to go chalk and win their regional, I mean, the travel, the time zone change as well is
Right?
something that's going to play a role in that. So that's something where like I like that there, but before we start like getting into even that thought, it's more of a like, hey, Beavers have an opportunity to go 1-0 and
Yep.
then take care of business as we go throughout the course of the weekend in order to be in that spot to host a super.
Yeah, I mean, and one of my favorite things, we'll leave you guys with this. I forget the statistic, but it is a glaring mark. If you win your first 2 games in a regional, something like over 75-80% of teams go on to win. When you win your first two and then you make a team who's come through the losers bracket beat you twice, your advantages are there. So again, Oregon State will get underway with St. Mary's on Friday. Beavers Edge will have coverage all weekend. Big shout out to Brogan Slaughter for joining us on the first part of the podcast. Ryan Harlan on the rest of the podcast. Catch us all this weekend at Goss and at BeaversEdge.com. This has been the Edge Podcast.